The morning sun filtered through the reinforced glass windows of the Army Aviation Center, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floors. Colonel James Mitchell walked through the corridor with measured steps, his dress uniform immaculate, every medal and ribbon positioned with military precision. At 38 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned every accolade through dedication, skill, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. His shoes clicked against the floor in a rhythmic pattern that had become familiar to everyone at the base, the sound of a man destined for greatness. News of his selection had spread through the installation like wildfire. Mitchell had been chosen for the Advanced Command Pilot Program, an exclusive initiative that selected only the most exceptional aviators in the entire United States Army. Out of thousands of qualified pilots, only 12 slots opened each year. Mitchell had secured one of them. This wasn't just a career achievement. It was a trajectory that would carry him toward the highest echelons of military aviation command. In his mind, he was already composing letters to his family, already imagining the ceremony where the Army's leadership would recognize his accomplishment. But success, Mitchell would soon discover, carried a price he hadn't anticipated. Not in the form of harder work or greater responsibility, but in the form of resentment from those left behind. Chief Warrant Officer Derek Santos stood in the maintenance hangar, surrounded by the mechanical guts of a dozen helicopters in various states of repair. His hands were perpetually stained with grease, his uniform sweat-dampened despite the early hour. At 53 years old, Santos had devoted 22 years to the Army, 2 more than Mitchell had even been alive. He had worked his way up from enlisted ranks, earned his warrant officer certification through night school and weekend training, and become one of the most knowledgeable helicopter mechanics on the continent. Yet something had gone terribly wrong along the way. Ambition had curdled into bitterness. Santos had applied for the Advanced Command Pilot Program 3 times. 3 times he had been rejected. His application materials were impeccable. His technical knowledge was encyclopedic. His safety record was spotless. But each rejection letter politely explained that while his qualifications were outstanding, other candidates demonstrated superior operational command experience. Each time, he would sit alone in his quarters, reading those words until they burned themselves into his memory. Each time his resentment grew deeper, took root more firmly. And then Mitchell, a man he had once considered a rising colleague, perhaps even a friend, had been selected on his first application. The unfairness of it consumed Santos in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Mitchell had a different background, a better education, connections to senior officers that Santos had never cultivated. Mitchell had the kind of natural charisma that made senior commanders want to mentor him, to invest in his future. Santos had talent, genuine expertise, but nobody seemed to notice. Nobody seemed to care. The military had passed him by, and the evidence walked the halls every morning wearing Mitchell's face. "He's out there again," Santos muttered to himself, watching through the hangar window as Mitchell's figure disappeared around the corner of the Flight Operations Building. The bitterness in his voice was so acute it seemed to poison the very air around him. "Who's out there?" Santos turned to find Major Linda Carver approaching, 2 cups of steaming coffee in her hands. She was offering one to him, which meant she'd been thinking about him, which meant she shared his concerns. Carver was 45, a brilliant administrator with a mind like a steel trap. She understood regulations, procedures, and protocols better than anyone at the installation. She had built her career on meticulous adherence to the rulebook. Yet 6 months ago, Mitchell had publicly questioned her safety protocols during a command review. It had been a reasonable technical question, the kind of thing that should have been handled privately. Instead, Mitchell had asked it in front of generals, in front of the commander, in front of people who mattered. Carver's face had flushed red. The generals had exchanged glances. Within weeks, Mitchell had been sent as a consultant to help refine her procedures. The implication was clear. She was outdated, potentially dangerous, in need of younger minds to guide her toward relevance. The humiliation had carved a canyon of resentment deep within her professional soul. "Colonel Mitchell," Santos said, accepting the coffee. "Celebrating his selection, I imagine." Carver's expression hardened. "It's obscene, really. 3 years at this installation, and he's already exceeded everyone else's career trajectory. There are people here with decades of service, and they'll never achieve what he will." They stood together in silence for a moment, two wounded professionals contemplating the injustice of a system that seemed designed to elevate the young and accomplished while leaving the experienced behind. Santos sipped his coffee, and something crystallized in his mind, not just resentment, but a dangerous thought. A thought that seemed to offer a path to balance the scales. "What if something went wrong during his certification?" Santos asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Carver's eyes narrowed. She understood immediately what he was suggesting, and instead of recoiling in shock or reporting him, she leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Santos continued, "what if the aircraft assigned to his test developed complications, technical issues that forced him to abort or worse?" "He would never pass," Carver whispered, understanding blossoming in her expression. "The certification board would flag him as unsafe. He'd be removed from consideration. His entire selection would be revoked." "And if the complications were serious enough," Santos added, his voice dropping even lower, "he might not even want to fly again, might request a transfer, might disappear from this installation entirely." The idea hung between them like a dark cloud. Both officers understood the severity of what they were contemplating. This wasn't office politics or professional sabotage. This was something far more dangerous, far more criminal. And yet the appeal was undeniable. It offered them something they'd lost: power. The power to determine someone else's fate. The power to prove that connections and natural talent weren't enough. That systems could be manipulated. That the game could be won through superior preparation and strategic action. "His certification is scheduled for 3 days, Carver said slowly. "Which helicopter is assigned?" "A 60A Black Hawk, tail number 472, Santos replied. He'd already begun thinking about this, already imagined the possibilities. Carver nodded. "The maintenance hangar is yours, you have access. You have knowledge, you have the perfect opportunity." "And you," Santos said, "have access to the digital records, the maintenance logs." "I could alter documentation," Carver confirmed. "Create false records showing systems operational when they're not." They looked at each other, two career military officers standing on the precipice of a decision that would destroy everything they'd built. Below them lay a choice between accepting their limitations or taking control of their own narratives through deception and sabotage. The temptation was intoxicating. "We make him fail," Santos said finally. "We make Colonel Mitchell learn that not everyone can be a hero." Major Carver raised her coffee cup in a gesture that resembled a toast. "To justice," she said. Neither officer realized that their conspiracy, birthed from professional jealousy and nurtured by bitterness, would ultimately expose them both. They didn't know that their plan would fail in spectacular fashion, that their victim would survive through skill and character they couldn't conceive of, and that their actions would spark an investigation that would unravel their entire conspiracy. They only knew in that moment that they finally had a purpose again, a mission, and they were determined to execute it perfectly. The maintenance hangar at 300 hours on a Tuesday morning was a cathedral of silence. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in clinical white illumination. The A-60A Black Hawk helicopter sat in the center of the bay, its massive fuselage gleaming under the lights. The aircraft's designation, tail number 472, had been meticulously selected by Santos. This particular helicopter had been recently returned from routine maintenance, meaning its systems had been legitimately serviced and reset. The perfect cover. No one would suspect sabotage if the aircraft had just been maintained. Chief Warrant Officer Derek Santos moved with practiced efficiency, his movements deliberate and economical. He'd worked in this hangar for 14 years. He knew every bolt, every line, every system. His muscle memory was so developed that he could perform complex maintenance tasks in near-total darkness. Tonight, darkness was precisely what he wanted, though the overhead lights were on. The presence of light made absence of witnesses seem more meaningful. If anyone had been monitoring security footage, they would see only a conscientious warrant officer conducting additional maintenance checks on an aircraft assigned to an important evaluation flight. He wore his standard olive drab uniform, carefully chosen because it bore the minimal amount of dust and grease that would mark him as obviously working with the aircraft's internals. In his hands, he carried a specialized tool kit, nothing that looked out of place in a military maintenance hangar. The tools were standard issue, available to anyone with his clearance. The only unique item was a small digital camera disguised as a pager, which Carver had provided for documenting his work. Insurance, she'd called it, evidence that he had done what he promised. The hydraulic system of the Black Hawk was a masterpiece of redundancy and engineering. The primary hydraulic system operated at 3,000 psi, powering the rotor blades, the flight control surfaces, and the landing gear. But the military had learned through decades of hard experience that single points of failure could be catastrophic. Therefore, the Black Hawk carried a backup hydraulic system, completely independent, running through different lines, powered by a separate pump. In theory, even if the primary system failed completely, the backup would activate automatically, allowing the pilot to maintain enough control to execute an emergency landing. In theory. Santos crawled beneath the aircraft, his flashlight gripped between his teeth. The smell of hydraulic fluid, lubricants, and aircraft sealant filled his nostrils. He'd loved this smell once. It represented competence, mastery, the tangible evidence of serving something larger than himself. Now it smelled like blood in the water. He located the backup hydraulic line running along the fuselage's underside. The line was color-coded blue, wrapped in protective sheathing to prevent damage during flight operations. Using a specialized wrench, Santos carefully disconnected the line at its pressure coupling. The disconnection required 2 full rotations, precise, deliberate movements that couldn't possibly be accidental. He worked slowly, aware that speed bred carelessness. The last thing he needed was hydraulic fluid spraying everywhere, creating evidence of tampering that maintenance personnel would immediately notice. The coupling came free with a soft hiss of depressurized air. Santos laid the line aside carefully, then repositioned it so that visual inspection would suggest it was still connected. He wrapped additional shielding around it, creating the illusion of integrity. To a casual observer, the system appeared operational. To anyone who actually tested the pressure sequence, the backup hydraulic system would show as inert, dead, useless in an emergency. From his position beneath the aircraft, Santos could hear footsteps above him, the night shift maintenance supervisor conducting routine rounds. The footsteps grew closer, then paused directly above him. Santos's heart hammered in his chest. If discovered now, he could claim he was performing additional checks, but the lie would only buy him so much credibility. He lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the footsteps finally moved away, echoing into the distance. He emerged from beneath the aircraft 40 minutes later, his uniform dusty but his expression calm. The first phase of sabotage was complete, but it was only half the plan. A disconnected hydraulic line could potentially be discovered during routine pre-flight inspections. Colonel Mitchell was meticulous, one of the things that made him such an exceptional pilot. He would perform a thorough pre-flight check. The documents needed to lie convincingly. That's where Major Linda Carver came in. At 4:30 hours, while Santos was finishing his physical work beneath the helicopter, Carver sat in the records office 2 buildings away. The office was normally closed at this hour, but she had administrative access 24 hours a day. She'd never used it for anything improper before, never even considered it. Now she moved through the files with the precision of someone executing a carefully rehearsed plan. The aircraft maintenance logbook existed in both physical and digital formats. She would need to alter both. She pulled up the digital system on her computer, entering her credentials. The system logged every access, but she'd already considered that. She would conduct all her alterations during a maintenance window that Santos had created, a supposedly routine system update that Carver herself had scheduled weeks earlier. During that window, any alterations would be attributed to automated backup and system refresh processes. Began typing. Primary hydraulic system, operational, pressure nominal, no leaks detected. Backup hydraulic system, pressure sequence test completed. System responsive and nominal, all redundancies confirmed operational. She added timestamps that would place the inspection 3 days earlier during normal maintenance shift hours. She assigned the imaginary inspection to a technician who'd recently been transferred to a different base, someone no longer present to confirm or deny the work. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed. This was it, the moment of no return. Once she hit save, the digital record would show a completely normal, properly maintained aircraft. She took a deep breath and pressed enter. The entry saved successfully. Carver leaned back in her chair, watching the cursor blink on an empty screen. She just created false military documentation. She just participated in a conspiracy to sabotage an aircraft. The magnitude of what she'd done should have horrified her. Instead, she felt strangely liberated. She'd taken control. She'd manipulated the system that had dismissed her. 20 minutes later, Santos's phone received a text message. Document phase complete. System shows full operational status. Good luck. Santos read the message sitting in the hangar, now cleaned and emptied of evidence. The aircraft sat before him, its exterior pristine and unsuspecting. To anyone examining it, the Black Hawk appeared completely normal, a well-maintained machine ready for important duty. But beneath its exterior, in the spaces invisible to casual observation, the aircraft carried death inside it like a hidden malignancy. Santos deleted the text message and powered off his phone. In 3 days, Colonel James Mitchell would conduct his pre-flight inspection and find nothing wrong. He would trust the documentation, trust the system, trust his colleagues. He would climb into the cockpit of a deliberately compromised aircraft and attempt to fly a test that his enemies had already predetermined he would fail. Neither Santos nor Carver knew that their sabotage, however meticulously planned, however cleverly executed, would soon face the one variable they hadn't accounted for: the extraordinary skill and survival instinct of a man who had spent 15 years preparing for precisely this kind of crisis. The helicopter was broken, but not broken enough, not broken in the way that would simply fail a test. It was broken in the way that would fight back against fate itself. The alarm on Mitchell's watch chimed at 500 hours. He'd been awake for 30 minutes already, lying in his quarters with his eyes open, running mental scenarios through his mind like a chess player preparing for a championship match. This was his pre-competition ritual: awake before the alarm, mind already engaged, body primed for what lay ahead. Today wasn't just another evaluation flight. Today was the threshold between the career he'd built and the career he'd always imagined. Today was the day everything changed. He dressed methodically: underwear, t-shirt, socks, each item selected with precision. Physical comfort would impact mental performance. He ate a light breakfast of oatmeal and fruit, nothing heavy enough to cause digestive distress but sufficient to maintain blood sugar stability during a flight that would last 4 hours. Hydration was critical. Dehydration impaired cognitive function and reaction time. He drank 18 ounces of water, monitored his caffeine intake to avoid jitters, and performed 45 minutes of light exercise to flush adrenaline and prime his cardiovascular system. By 6:30 hours, Colonel James Mitchell stood in the flight operations office, dressed in his flight suit, olive drab with his name patch embroidered in white letters, his rank insignia on the shoulders, a dozen combat and achievement ribbons on his chest. The certification board was already assembling. 3 evaluators from Army Aviation Command, the chief inspector from the Army Aviation Center of Excellence, and the commanding general of the installation. The pressure was immense, but pressure was what separated ordinary pilots from exceptional ones. The weather forecast had been checked and rechecked. Clear skies, visibility unlimited, light winds from the northwest. Perfect conditions. The kind of conditions that wouldn't provide an excuse for poor performance. Mitchell would have nowhere to hide. Only pure skill and decision-making would determine his fate. At 6:45 hours, Mitchell walked toward the helicopter. The morning sun was beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The U-60A Black Hawk sat in the flight line, its rotors folded, its exterior gleaming in the dawn light. Tail number 472, a magnificent machine that had logged over 3,000 flight hours without serious incident. Santos and Carver's sabotage was meticulous enough that it had passed every visible inspection. Mitchell began his pre-flight walk-around at 700 hours, exactly 1 hour before the scheduled takeoff. This wasn't a cursory glance, it was a methodical, exhaustive examination that would take 45 minutes. He circled the aircraft slowly, his trained eye examining every external surface. The landing gear, check. The fuselage integrity, check. The rotor blade condition. Each blade was examined for cracks, separation, wear. The tail rotor, perfectly aligned, no visible damage. The antenna, secured properly. The fuel cells, visual inspection confirmed proper appearance. He climbed beneath the aircraft, examining the landing gear mechanisms, hydraulic lines, and structural components. The disconnected backup hydraulic line lay hidden beneath layers of protective sheathing, exactly as Santos had positioned it. Mitchell's flashlight beam passed within inches of it, but the deliberate concealment held. His mind was focused on the systems that should be visible, not on the ones deliberately hidden from sight. The pre-flight checklist continued: fuel quantity verification, oil analysis results, battery condition, air intake filter status. Everything appeared nominal. Everything showed that the aircraft was flight-ready. Mitchell signed the maintenance logbook, his signature authorizing the aircraft for critical evaluation flight. The document showed all systems operational, all redundancies confirmed. His signature gave that false document legitimacy. At 7:45 hours, Mitchell climbed into the cockpit. The familiar ergonomics of the Black Hawk embraced him like an old friend. He'd flown this model for 5 years, had logged nearly 800 hours in similar aircraft. His hands moved through the startup sequence with unconscious competence. The avionics came alive, displays illuminating with information about aircraft systems, fuel status, electrical power, hydraulic pressure. The primary hydraulic system displayed green, pressure nominal at 3,100 psi. The backup hydraulic system indicator flickered to life, showing normal pressure readings. Of course it did. Carver had altered the digital displays to show false readings. The false documentation flowed through the aircraft's computer systems, creating a complete illusion of operational integrity. The rotor system engaged with a deep mechanical sound, the massive blades beginning their rotation. Slower at first, then building speed as the engines powered up. The pitch of the rotors changed as they found their operational frequency. Vibrations translated through the airframe, a sensation Mitchell had come to recognize as normal. The aircraft was alive, ready, powerful. At 800 hours, Mitchell received clearance from the control tower. "Colonel Mitchell, you are cleared for takeoff. Conditions are visual flight rules, unlimited ceiling, visibility 10 miles. Have a good evaluation flight." The voice in the radio was Major Linda Carver, monitoring from the tower. Mitchell had no way of knowing that she was sitting in the communications center, listening as the man she'd sabotaged lifted into the air. Mitchell pulled collective, and the Black Hawk lifted smoothly from the tarmac. The landing gear retracted with hydraulic precision. The aircraft gained altitude, moving away from the installation toward the designated test airspace. For the first 30 minutes, everything performed exactly as it should. The aircraft responded to his inputs with the precision of a finely tuned instrument. Mitchell executed barrel rolls, testing the aircraft's agility and his own instinctive reactions. The G-forces pressed him into his seat as the horizon spun around him. He performed controlled descents, demonstrating mastery of the vertical axis. He executed precision hovers, holding the aircraft motionless at altitude while maintaining exact heading and altitude. The evaluation board in the control tower watched and took notes. Then, at the 45-minute mark, something changed. The controls felt subtly different, not dramatically wrong, nothing that would immediately alert an inexperienced pilot. But Mitchell had logged 15 years of flight time. His muscle memory had developed to a level where he could detect deviations of mere millimeters in control response. The collective stick, the lever that controlled rotor pitch and generated lift, felt incrementally heavier than it should. The hydraulic assistance that normally made the system responsive was diminished. Mitchell performed a diagnostic maneuver, requesting specific control responses from the aircraft. The Black Hawk reacted a fraction of a second slower than normal. The response was blunted, as if the hydraulic system was struggling against resistance. Simultaneously, the instruments began displaying erratic readings. The primary hydraulic pressure fluctuated between 2,900 and 3,100 psi. That kind of variation shouldn't occur during level flight. His stomach tightened. In 15 years of flying, Mitchell had learned to trust his instincts. They'd saved his life twice before, once during a training flight, once during actual combat operations. Every nerve in his body was now transmitting the same message. Something was profoundly wrong with this aircraft. Mitchell keyed his radio, his voice steady despite his accelerating pulse. "Control, Colonel Mitchell. I'm reading inconsistencies in hydraulic pressure, fluctuations in primary system readings. Requesting immediate system check before continuing with test sequence." There was a pause, just a moment of silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then Carver's voice crackled back through the speakers. "Colonel Mitchell, your readings appear nominal from our position. All instruments show green across the board. We're seeing no anomalies in our monitoring systems. Recommend you continue with the evaluation as scheduled." Mitchell's jaw tightened. The ground readings showed everything normal because Carver had designed the false data to present exactly that illusion. But his instincts, 15 years of accumulated experience, screamed that something was wrong. He looked down at the altimeter, 2,000 feet above ground. He looked at the fuel gauge, sufficient for another 2 hours of flight. He had a choice: trust the instruments and the ground control, or trust the voice inside him that had kept him alive through career after career. Mitchell's hands gripped the cyclic control stick a fraction tighter. Carver had told him to continue. The ground readings showed normal, but every instinct forged through 15 years of aviation experience screamed that continuing was a mistake. For a moment that lasted only 3 seconds but felt like 3 minutes, he hung suspended between two decisions: obey the institutional authority telling him everything was fine, or trust the inner voice that had saved his life in combat. "Roger, control," he transmitted, his voice professionally neutral. "Continuing with test sequence." It was the wrong choice. But in that moment, with evaluators watching, with the certification board expecting him to proceed, with the psychological weight of a career-defining test pressing down on him, Mitchell chose to trust the system over his gut. It was a decision he would spend the rest of his life examining. He pushed the Black Hawk into the next maneuver, a controlled descent from 2,000 feet, part of the evaluation protocol. The aircraft began its descent with what should have been smooth, predictable control inputs. Mitchell reduced collective pitch, lowering the rotor angle to allow the aircraft to descend while maintaining forward speed. That's when the primary hydraulic system failed completely. The failure wasn't gradual, it was catastrophic. The pressure gauge that had been fluctuating suddenly plummeted to zero. The aircraft's control response vanished like a switch being flipped. Mitchell's inputs on the cyclic stick, the control that governed pitch and roll, met with sudden, terrifying resistance. The cyclic moved, but the aircraft's response was sluggish, unpredictable. Simultaneously, a cacophony of alarms erupted through the cockpit. The master warning light flashed crimson. The hydraulic failure alarm screamed at 120 decibels. The engine fire detection system activated, not because there was fire, but because the sudden loss of hydraulic pressure triggered cascade failures throughout the aircraft's interconnected systems. "I have hydraulic failure," Mitchell shouted into the radio, his professional composure cracking as the reality of the emergency registered. Primary system showing zero pressure, requesting immediate clearance to return to base. But there was no time for clearance. There was no time for anything except reaction. The backup hydraulic system should have engaged automatically. The redundancy was supposed to activate within milliseconds of primary system failure. Mitchell waited for the familiar feel of restored control, the return of hydraulic assistance that would allow him to maintain flight. He felt nothing. The backup system was dead, disconnected, useless. Santos's sabotage had found its moment. With the primary hydraulic system offline and the backup inert, Mitchell was flying the Black Hawk with absolutely no power assistance. All control inputs had to be generated purely by cable tension and mechanical linkages. The aircraft weighed 8,000 pounds. The control inputs he would normally execute with 5 pounds of pressure now required 50 pounds of muscle. His arms, powerful from a lifetime of athletic training, began to burn immediately. But that wasn't the worst of it. As Mitchell fought to maintain control of the aircraft, the damaged tail rotor, the component that Santos had weakened during his sabotage, began to lose structural integrity under the stress of flight. The tail rotor was designed to counteract the torque produced by the main rotor blades. Without it, the aircraft would begin to spin uncontrollably. The damage Santos had inflicted months earlier had been subtle enough to pass inspection, but critical enough to fail under stress. The first indication was a subtle vibration, then a shimmy, then a violent oscillation that threatened to tear the aircraft apart from the inside out. "I'm losing tail rotor authority," Mitchell transmitted, fighting with every ounce of strength to maintain the cyclic in his hands. Sweat poured down his face. His vision began to tunnel with the intensity of physical exertion and psychological pressure. The aircraft was spinning now, slowly at first, then faster. The altimeter showed 1,500 feet. Falling. The airspeed indicator was bleeding down as the aircraft's aerodynamic efficiency plummeted. Without proper rotor control, the Black Hawk was becoming more projectile than aircraft. This was the moment, the exact moment, when most pilots would experience complete panic. The instruments were screaming. The aircraft was dying. The ground was rushing up. Every system was failing. In the tower, the evaluation board was watching the radar blip that represented Mitchell's helicopter beginning an uncontrolled descent. In the control room, Major Linda Carver's face went white. She hadn't expected it to happen this fast. She hadn't expected it to happen at all. She'd convinced herself that the sabotage would cause a gradual degradation, a failed test, not an actual emergency. Santos, standing in the back of the tower watching the radar display, looked like a man watching his own death unfold in real time. But Mitchell's mind had entered a state of hyperclarity. Fear didn't paralyze him. It crystallized his thinking. Every piece of training he'd ever received, every emergency scenario he'd ever studied, every near-death experience he'd survived suddenly organized itself into a coherent action plan. He was going to execute an auto-rotation. The auto-rotation was the most dangerous emergency maneuver in helicopter aviation. It required the pilot to cut engine power completely, allowing gravity to pull the aircraft downward, while the falling motion generated airflow through the rotor system. That falling air through rotor generated just enough lift to slow the aircraft's descent to a survivable speed. But it required split-second timing, precise altitude calculations, and nerves of absolute steel. Mitchell's hands moved with supernatural calm. He cut the engine power completely. The rotor RPM began to increase as gravity pulled the aircraft downward. The aircraft was now a controlled falling object, dropping toward the earth while the rotor blades spun faster and faster. The altimeter showed 1,000 feet. Mitchell's vision was ice cold despite the adrenaline. He was aware of every parameter: descent rate, airspeed, rotor RPM, remaining altitude. The world had compressed into mathematical calculations of survival. 800 feet. The ground was becoming detail visible. He could see individual trees, the shape of the landing zone, a clear field approximately 300 meters away. 600 feet. His muscles were screaming as he fought the controls without hydraulic assistance. The aircraft wanted to continue its spin, wanted to fall. Mitchell forced it into alignment with the landing zone. 400 feet. He began to increase the collective pitch, allowing the rotor blades to bite the air more aggressively. The airspeed dropped. The descent rate slowed. The aircraft was transforming from projectile to parachute. 200 feet. Mitchell could see individual blades of grass. His heart was hammering hard enough that he could feel it in his fingertips. 100 feet. The ground was approaching at a dangerous velocity, but it was no longer catastrophic. He continued his descent, controlling the angle of approach, managing the rotor RPM to maintain just enough lift to prevent complete free fall. 50 feet. Mitchell eased back on the cyclic, flaring the aircraft's nose up to present the undercarriage to the ground at the best angle for impact. 20 feet. He could smell the earth, could sense the proximity of solid ground. Impact. The Black Hawk hit the field hard. The landing gear compressed under the stress of an emergency landing at high descent rate. The aircraft skidded across grass and dirt, leaving a trail of destruction behind it. Debris scattered in all directions. The rotor blades struck the ground once, then the aircraft pitched forward, nearly cartwheeling before falling back onto its landing gear. The main rotor slowed. The engines died completely. Dust settled. Mitchell sat in the cockpit, his hands still gripping the cyclic, his legs trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline overload. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then the emergency systems on the ground activated. Alarms from the base tower began wailing. Fire trucks and rescue helicopters launched into motion. Mitchell released the cyclic slowly, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the controls. He defied physics. He defied his saboteurs. He defied death itself. And he was alive. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division arrived at the crash site within 90 minutes. By that time, Mitchell had been transported to the base medical facility for evaluation, where doctors confirmed he'd sustained minor injuries, bruised ribs, mild whiplash, and lacerations from broken glass, but nothing life-threatening. His survival bordered on miraculous, which immediately raised questions that demanded answers. Chief Warrant Officer Raymond Martinez led the investigation team. Martinez had spent 23 years investigating military crimes, everything from theft to assault to murder. He had an intuitive ability to read crime scenes, to understand what evidence was telling him. As he approached the damaged Black Hawk helicopter, his experienced eyes immediately detected something that the initial response team might have missed. The damage pattern was wrong. In a simple mechanical failure, hydraulic line rupture, bearing failure, structural crack, the damage would radiate outward from a single point of failure. But the Black Hawk's damage suggested multiple systems had failed nearly simultaneously. Martinez circled the aircraft, examining the fuselage, the rotor system, the tail boom. "Something isn't adding up," he muttered to his senior investigator, Lieutenant Sarah Chen. "Get me the maintenance records. I want to know exactly what was done to this aircraft in the last month." Chen's team worked through the documentation. The maintenance log showed multiple system checks, all marked as complete and operational. Santos's signature was on every entry. Carver's digital records confirmed each procedure. Everything appeared legitimate, documented, and thorough. "Check the security footage," Martinez instructed. "Night shift lasts 72 hours. I want to see who accessed this aircraft." It took 4 hours to locate and review the footage. The security camera in the maintenance hangar had captured everything in grainy digital resolution. At 300 hours on Tuesday morning, the footage showed Chief Warrant Officer Derek Santos beneath the Black Hawk, working on the hydraulic system. The footage clearly showed him disconnecting the blue-coated backup hydraulic line, a deliberate action that couldn't possibly be accidental. Martinez watched the footage in silence, his jaw tightening. This wasn't an accident investigation anymore. This was a sabotage investigation. This was attempted murder. "Find Santos," he said quietly, "now." Santos was in the supply building when military police arrived. He was cataloging inventory, a perfectly ordinary task that gave him the appearance of normalcy. But the moment MP officers entered the building, his face went pale. He knew. Some instinct told him that the moment he'd been dreading had arrived. "Chief Warrant Officer Santos, you need to come with us," one of the officers said, his hand resting near his service weapon despite Santos being an unarmed military officer. Santos's interrogation began in a small room adjacent to the Criminal Investigation Division office. Martinez sat across from him, a thin folder on the table between them. Inside that folder was a single photograph, a still frame from the security footage showing Santos disconnecting the hydraulic line. "I'm going to ask you some questions about the U-60A Black Hawk, tail number 472, Martinez began, his voice calm and professional. "On Tuesday morning at 300 hours, our security cameras captured you working on this aircraft. I want to know what you were doing." Santos's eyes fixed on the photograph. The color drained completely from his face. For 30 seconds he said nothing. Then his voice emerged, barely above a whisper. "I want a lawyer." But Major Linda Carver made a different choice. When investigators approached her in her office 30 minutes later, she knew immediately what they'd discovered. The photographs of Santos's handiwork, the security footage, the evidence of her digital tampering, all of it had probably already been uncovered. Carver was an intelligent woman. She was also a pragmatist. "I'll talk to you," she said immediately, before the investigators could even present their case. "But I want a deal. I want immunity from the attempted murder charges. I cooperated, I'll cooperate, and I can provide evidence against Santos." Martinez shook his head. "That's not how this works, Major. You're both being charged with the same crimes. Whether you talk is up to you, but immunity isn't on the table." Carver's face hardened. She'd miscalculated. She'd believed that cooperating with the investigation would earn her leniency. Instead, she was learning that conspiracy meant shared culpability. You couldn't negotiate your way out of trying to kill a fellow officer. "I want a lawyer," she said, mirroring Santos's decision. But by then, the investigation had already moved beyond needing their confessions. Digital forensics had pulled Carver's computer access logs, revealing every moment she'd altered the maintenance records. Timestamps showed her modifications occurring during a scheduled maintenance window that she herself had created weeks earlier. The sophistication of her cover-up attempt actually made her guilt more obvious. No accidental data corruption would create such perfectly false documentation. Cell phone records showed text message exchanges between Santos and Carver over the previous 72 hours. The messages weren't explicitly incriminating. They'd been careful about that, but the pattern was damning. Phase 1 complete. Document phase complete. Good luck. Investigators interviewed the transferred technician whose name appeared on false maintenance records. He confirmed he'd never performed any work on the aircraft. He'd been stationed at Fort Campbell when the alleged maintenance occurred. The investigation took 3 weeks to compile into a comprehensive case file. By the end, the evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showing Santos deliberately disconnecting the backup hydraulic system. Digital forensics proving Carver altered maintenance records with false timestamps. Text message exchanges showing coordination between the two conspirators. Multiple witnesses confirming motivation. Santos's rejected applications for advancement. Carver's humiliation during Mitchell's safety protocol review. Expert testimony from aerospace engineers confirming the hydraulic disconnection and tail rotor damage were intentional, not accidental. Mitchell was interviewed extensively as the victim witness. He described the test, the system's failures, the emergency landing, and the moment he realized something was deliberately wrong with the aircraft. By that point, he'd already suspected sabotage. The evidence was too coordinated, too precisely designed to fail. "I trusted them," Mitchell said quietly during his formal statement. "I trusted Santos to maintain the aircraft properly. I trusted Carver to be honest about the systems. That trust was weaponized against me." The most damning moment came when investigators confronted Santos with the security footage during a follow-up interrogation. His attorney instructed him not to speak, but the weight of visual evidence broke something inside him. "It was supposed to just be a failed test," Santos said suddenly, his voice cracking. "Just a failed evaluation. He was supposed to abort the mission, get marked down, lose the certification. That was all. We never thought." His attorney immediately silenced him, but the damage was done. Santos had confessed to conspiracy to sabotage, to deliberately introducing false maintenance records, and in his confession, he'd inadvertently revealed the escalation of their intent. A failed test wasn't the real goal. The goal had been something worse. Investigators discovered additional evidence in Carver's personal files, notes discussing worst-case scenarios, discussions about how a catastrophic failure during the test would remove Mitchell from the program permanently. The intent had evolved from professional sabotage to something far more sinister. The case was complete. The evidence was airtight. The criminal conspiracy had been exposed in its entirety, not through the saboteurs' cooperation, but through their own carelessness in covering their tracks. Now came the legal reckoning. The court-martial of Chief Warrant Officer Derek Santos and Major Linda Carver began on a cold February morning in the military courthouse at Fort Rucker, Alabama. The case had captured national attention. Not just military news, but mainstream media outlets were covering the trial extensively. The headline wrote itself: "Military officers charged with sabotaging fellow pilots' aircraft, attempted murder." The prosecution was led by Colonel James Hendricks, a military prosecutor with 18 years of experience in complex criminal cases. His opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. On March 15th of this year, 2 military officers deliberately sabotaged an aircraft carrying Colonel James Mitchell. They disconnected critical safety systems. They falsified military records. They did this because they resented his advancement. They expected Colonel Mitchell to fail his certification test. What they didn't expect was Colonel Mitchell's skill, courage, and determination to survive. What they didn't expect was that their conspiracy would be exposed, and they would face justice for attempting to murder a fellow officer. The defense team scrambled for relevance. Santos's attorney argued that the sabotage was intended to cause a failed test, not a crash. Carver's attorney claimed she was following orders, that she was complicit but not the primary architect. Both arguments fell apart under the weight of evidence. The prosecution's first witness was Chief Investigator Raymond Martinez. He presented the security footage in excruciating detail. The video showed Santos beneath the Black Hawk, deliberately disconnecting the hydraulic coupling. His movements were practiced, intentional, methodical. There was no fumbling, no uncertainty, only precise execution of a plan. "This is not a man accidentally damaging equipment," Martinez testified. "This is a technician deliberately sabotaging a critical system. Every action demonstrates knowledge of what he was doing and intent to compromise the aircraft." The cross-examination was brutal. Santos's attorney tried to suggest the footage was edited, manipulated, or misinterpreted. Martinez remained unmoved. "I've investigated military crimes for 23 years, he said calmly. "I've reviewed thousands of hours of security footage. I know what manipulation looks like. This is authentic, unaltered, and shows deliberate sabotage." The prosecution's second witness was Dr. Elizabeth Ashford, an aerospace engineer who specialized in helicopter hydraulic systems. She was brilliant, authoritative, and devastating to the defense case. "The backup hydraulic line was not damaged by accident," Dr. Ashford testified, her voice steady and clinical. "The coupling was deliberately disconnected using tools specifically designed for that purpose. The disconnection required application of precise torque measurements and knowledge of the system. An accidental rupture would show completely different damage patterns. This shows intentional disconnection." Under cross-examination, she was unshakable. Could this have happened accidentally? No. Could this have been misidentified in investigation? No. The evidence is unambiguous. This was deliberate sabotage. The prosecution's third witness was Colonel James Mitchell himself. When Mitchell took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He wore his dress uniform, medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His testimony was measured and powerful. He described the flight, the subtle degradation in performance, the moment he realized the systems were deliberately compromised, and the emergency landing that saved his life. "I trusted Chief Warrant Officer Santos," Mitchell said quietly. "I trusted him to maintain my aircraft properly. I trusted Major Carver to be honest about maintenance records. That trust was a weapon they used against me. They weaponized my own faith in the system to try to kill me." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the judge seemed affected by Mitchell's words. The prosecution presented digital forensics experts who detailed Carver's tampering with maintenance records. They showed how she'd altered timestamps, created false entries, and manipulated the system during a maintenance window she'd created specifically for concealing her actions. This required detailed knowledge of the database, the digital forensics expert testified. This required administrative access, and this required intentional action to create false records. This is not someone making a clerical error. This is someone deliberately falsifying military documentation to facilitate sabotage. Text message evidence was presented, read aloud in the courtroom with chilling effect. Phase 1 complete. Document phase complete. Good luck. Each message was introduced with expert testimony explaining how the phrasing demonstrated coordination and intent. The defense teams attempted to mount counterarguments, presenting character witnesses who testified to Santos's and Carver's military service and dedication. The judge listened respectfully but seemed unmoved. Character evidence couldn't overcome physical evidence and documented intent. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Colonel Hendricks with controlled intensity. "The defense wants you to believe this was a prank gone wrong, that these were good officers who made a mistake. But the evidence shows premeditation, coordination, and deliberate action. They disconnected a critical safety system. They falsified military records. They sent coded messages to coordinate their actions." And when Colonel Mitchell performed an emergency landing that should have been catastrophic, they realized their mistake. But they didn't confess. They didn't cooperate. They lawyered up and tried to hide behind legal technicalities. That's not the behavior of officers who made a mistake. That's the behavior of conspirators trying to avoid the consequences of attempted murder. The verdicts came back within 2 hours of jury deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of conspiracy. Guilty of sabotage. Guilty of falsifying military records. Guilty of endangering aircraft operations. Guilty of attempted murder. When the verdicts were read, Santos's face went completely blank. Carver seemed to collapse inward, her posture folding as the weight of her convictions settled upon her. Sentencing took place the following morning. The military judge, Colonel David Williamson, who had presided over the trial with impartial authority, addressed the courtroom with the gravity the moment demanded. Chief Warrant Officer Derek Santos and Major Linda Carver, you have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit sabotage, falsifying military documents, and attempted murder. Your actions represent a profound betrayal of the military oath you took. You weaponized your positions of trust against a fellow officer. You endangered an aircraft. You nearly caused the deaths of a trained pilot and potentially others. The military exists as an institution built on trust between service members. You violated that trust in the most fundamental way. The judge paused, looking directly at both defendants. Chief Warrant Officer Santos, I sentence you to 25 years at the United States Disciplinary Barracks. You are dishonorably discharged from the United States Army. Your military pension is forfeited. You are stripped of all rank and privileges. Santos's body went rigid. 25 years meant he would be in his 70s before release. It meant his career was over. It meant everything he'd built in the military would be erased. Major Linda Carver, I sentence you to 30 years at the United States Disciplinary Barracks. Your rank makes your betrayal more egregious. You were trusted with administrative authority, and you used it to facilitate conspiracy. I sentence you to 30 years. You are dishonorably discharged from the United States Army. Your military pension is forfeited. You are stripped of all rank and privileges. Carver made a small sound, almost a whimper, as the sentence was pronounced. The judge continued, both of you will be transported immediately to military detention facilities. You will have the right to appeal your convictions, but your freedom ends today. You attempted to destroy a man's career and nearly took his life. Justice demands accountability, and justice is being served. As military police escorted Santos and Carver from the courtroom, the judge looked toward the gallery where Mitchell was seated. Their eyes met briefly. The judge nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Justice had been served, but at a cost that haunted everyone who had witnessed it. The trial was over. The conspiracy was exposed. The saboteurs were imprisoned. But the institutional damage remained. A reminder that trust, once weaponized, left scars on everyone in its vicinity. 4 months after the court-martial verdict, Colonel James Mitchell stood in the ornate auditorium of the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes. The space was designed to inspire. High ceilings, formal architecture, the weight of military history in every corner. 300 attendees filled the seats, including senior military leadership, congressional representatives, aviation experts, and members of the press. An American flag hung prominently behind the podium where General Michael Richardson, the Chief of Staff of the Army, prepared to address the audience. Mitchell wore his dress uniform, pressed to perfection, every ribbon in exact position. But beneath the military formality, he was acutely aware of the surrealism of the moment. Months earlier, he'd been fighting for his life in a dying helicopter. Weeks earlier, he'd testified against his saboteurs in a courtroom. Now he stood on the precipice of recognition he'd never anticipated. General Richardson approached the podium with measured authority. His voice carried the weight of institutional power when he began to speak. Today, we honor Colonel James Mitchell, a pilot whose extraordinary skill, courage, and character exemplify the highest ideals of military service. On March 15th of this year, Colonel Mitchell faced a situation that would have challenged even the most experienced aviators. Sabotaged systems, disabled backup redundancies, an aircraft deliberately compromised by fellow officers whose jealousy had overcome their integrity. The general paused, allowing the magnitude of the statement to settle over the audience. What Colonel Mitchell did that day wasn't just extraordinary flying. It was an affirmation of the character that separates those who build from those who destroy. In the face of catastrophic system failure, Colonel Mitchell didn't panic. He didn't freeze. He executed the most dangerous emergency maneuver in aviation with the precision and composure that saved his life. General Richardson opened a presentation box, removing a medal suspended from a ribbon of blue and white, the Distinguished Flying Cross. Colonel James Mitchell, for extraordinary heroism and exceptional aviator skill demonstrated during an emergency landing on March 15th, the Army presents you with the Distinguished Flying Cross. This medal recognizes not just your survival, but your triumph over malice through preparation, skill, and unshakable character. The audience erupted in applause. Mitchell stepped forward to receive the medal. As General Richardson placed the decoration on his chest, their eyes met briefly. The general's expression conveyed something beyond the formal ceremony: respect, perhaps, or recognition that Mitchell had faced something far more dangerous than mechanical failure. He'd faced human betrayal and survived it. The ceremony continued with additional presentations. The Secretary of the Army addressed the audience, emphasizing the significance of the incident as a case study in institutional integrity. Congressional representatives spoke about the importance of protecting service members from internal threats. Mitchell received commendation after commendation, each one adding weight to a recognition he'd never sought. But the most significant moment came when General Richardson announced Mitchell's promotion. Effective immediately, Colonel James Mitchell is promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. General Mitchell will assume command of the Army Aviation Regiment, overseeing 300 pilots and 4 major air bases. This promotion reflects not just his exceptional flying skills, but his demonstrated ability to maintain integrity, even when facing conspiracy from within his own institution. Mitchell stood silently as the general pinned the star insignia on his shoulder. Brigadier General. The promotion he'd been working toward throughout his entire career had arrived not through the certification test he'd been scheduled to take, but through survival and vindication. It was a hollow victory in some ways, achieved through circumstances he'd never chosen. After the ceremony, Mitchell was surrounded by military and civilian leaders offering congratulations. But what struck him most profoundly was a conversation with the independent evaluator who had witnessed his original certification test, the official who had observed the first 30 minutes before the crisis occurred. "General Mitchell," the evaluator said, extending his hand, "I want you to know that in those first 30 minutes before the sabotage became critical, I was recording observations. I documented exceptional performance, outstanding flying. You would have passed that certification test regardless, not just passed but exceeded expectations. Your enemies tried to prevent something you'd already earned through skill and dedication." It was a small thing, confirmation that his success was legitimate, earned through merit rather than through sympathy following catastrophe. But it mattered immensely. In the weeks following the ceremony, Mitchell began to receive briefing materials about his new command. He would oversee flight operations across 4 air bases, managing pilot training, safety protocols, and operational readiness for 12 squadrons of aviation units. The responsibility was immense. The opportunity to implement change was equally significant. Mitchell scheduled meetings with the Aviation Safety Board, with maintenance operations, with digital records management. He'd spent months processing what had happened to him, understanding how systems designed for safety had been corrupted by individuals willing to abuse their positions of trust. "I want us to implement a double verification system for all critical maintenance," he instructed his operations team. "No single individual should be able to alter maintenance records or disconnect critical safety systems without secondary confirmation from an independent observer. The sabotage we experienced was possible because individual officers had too much unsupervised authority over critical systems. The aviation community was already buzzing about the incident. Flight schools had begun using Mitchell's emergency landing as a case study in advanced pilot training. The auto-rotation he'd executed was being dissected in classrooms across the country. But Mitchell was more interested in the institutional lessons than in his own heroic narrative. He established the Integrity in Aviation Safety Program, a comprehensive initiative requiring all aviation personnel to undergo training in ethics, professional conduct, and the dangers of allowing personal grievances to compromise institutional safety. The program included case studies based directly on his experience, names changed for privacy, but the lessons unmistakable. Mitchell also created a mentorship program for young pilots, emphasizing that technical skill without character was worse than useless. It was dangerous. He spent his first month in the new position meeting with pilots individually, understanding their aspirations, their concerns, their motivations. Success in aviation, he told a group of young warrant officers during one training session, isn't about being the smartest in the room or having the most flight hours. It's about maintaining integrity even when nobody's watching. It's about choosing the harder path when the easier path is tempting. It's about building others up instead of tearing them down. The young officers listened with unusual attentiveness. They knew who Mitchell was. They understood what he'd survived, and they understood that his words came from hard-earned experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Institutional change moved slowly, but it moved. The Army Inspector General's office launched a comprehensive audit of maintenance procedures across all aviation units. Digital security protocols were upgraded. Mandatory secondary verification processes were implemented. The system that had nearly killed Mitchell was being reformed, one policy at a time. 6 months into Mitchell's command, he received an invitation to testify before Congress about aviation safety. The House Armed Services Committee wanted to understand the institutional vulnerabilities that had allowed the sabotage to occur. Mitchell sat in the Capitol building, facing representatives and senators, explaining the details of his experience. He described the disconnected hydraulic line, the falsified records, the inadequate oversight mechanisms. But more importantly, he emphasized the human element, how personal ambition curdled into jealousy, how professional resentment could transform into criminal action. The military depends on trust, Mitchell testified. We depend on fellow service members to maintain our aircraft properly, to be honest about system status, to prioritize the mission over personal grievances. But trust without verification is vulnerability. We need systems that assume good intentions but verify through mechanical and procedural safeguards. The sabotage I experienced should never happen again, not because we'll somehow eliminate human jealousy or resentment, but because we'll design systems that make sabotage practically impossible. The congressional testimony was featured in newspapers nationwide. Mitchell became not just a survivor, but an advocate for institutional reform. His promotion, his awards, his new authority, all of it was now directed toward preventing others from experiencing what he had survived. In the quiet moments, late at night in his new office, Mitchell sometimes thought about Santos and Carver in their prison cells. He harbored no hatred for them, only sadness that ambition had twisted them so thoroughly that they'd chosen destruction over acceptance. But their failure had become his purpose. Their sabotage had revealed vulnerabilities that were now being addressed. Institutional change, real and measurable, was flowing from their conspiracy. Mitchell had been given a broken helicopter to fail his test. Instead, his survival had transformed aviation safety and exposed institutional vulnerabilities that required fixing. The test he'd passed was far more significant than any certification could ever be. 3 years after the emergency landing, Brigadier General James Mitchell stood in the center of the Army Aviation Museum at Fort Rucker, Alabama. The museum had recently completed a new exhibit dedicated to aviation safety and emergency procedures. In the center of the exhibit stood a display case containing a photograph of the damaged A-60A Black Hawk helicopter, tail number 472, the aircraft that should have killed him. The photograph showed the fuselage scarred from impact, the rotor blades bent from contact with earth, the body of the machine twisted by the violence of the emergency landing. Beside the photograph was a placard with Mitchell's name, the date of the incident, and a detailed explanation of the sabotage, the emergency landing technique, and the institutional reforms that had followed. Mitchell studied the photograph with emotions he still couldn't quite articulate. The machine in the image had been weaponized against him, deliberately compromised by colleagues he'd trusted. Yet that same compromised machine had become a teaching tool, a monument to human resilience, and a catalyst for change that had already saved lives. He thought about the statistics compiled by his safety division. 17 incidents prevented through the new double verification protocols. 4 instances of potential sabotage detected through enhanced oversight procedures. Dozens of flights safely completed because pilots had been trained in the emergency techniques that Mitchell had demonstrated under the worst possible circumstances. His survival had created a ripple effect of safety that extended far beyond himself. A young captain approached Mitchell respectfully. Captain Sarah Chen, no relation to the investigator who'd worked the case, though they'd become friends during the investigation. Chen was one of the new generation of pilots Mitchell had mentored through his aviation safety program. "General Mitchell, thank you for being here," Chen said. "This means a lot to all of us. Seeing the exhibit, understanding the history, it changes how we approach our responsibilities as pilots." Mitchell smiled. This was the reason he'd survived, not to receive medals or promotion, though those had come, but to influence the next generation, to pass forward the lessons that had nearly cost him his life. "Captain Chen, how are your emergency procedure scores?" Mitchell asked. "Top of my class, sir," she answered proudly. "And I've been teaching the auto-rotation technique to other pilots. The way you described it, the mental state during crisis, the importance of preparation meeting opportunity, it's transformed how everyone approaches emergency scenarios." This was the legacy Mitchell had been building, not monuments to himself, but competence in others. The idea that his near-death experience could become wisdom transmitted to pilots who would never face his particular crisis, but might face crises of their own. Later that evening, Mitchell dined with several of his senior staff members in the officers' club. The conversation turned, as it often did, to the incident and its aftermath. "Sir, I've been thinking about Santos and Carver," said Colonel Marcus Washington, Mitchell's deputy commander. 25 years in prison, 30 for Carver. They're in their 50s now. They'll leave prison as old men. Mitchell set down his fork thoughtfully. "I think about them sometimes," he admitted. "Not with anger anymore. That burned away years ago. Now I mostly feel sadness. They had careers, legitimate accomplishments, and they threw it all away because they couldn't accept that someone younger was getting opportunities they'd missed." "Do you ever regret not being harsher with them?" Washington asked. "Some people think the sentences were lenient, given that they attempted murder." "No," Mitchell said firmly. "The sentences are appropriate. 30 years for Carver means she'll likely spend the rest of her natural life imprisoned. Santos has 25 years. He'll be released as an elderly man with no pension, no reputation, no prospects. Justice was served. What I've chosen to do is move forward, not dwell on punishment. That's the difference between justice and revenge." The conversation shifted to discussions of operational readiness and pilot development, but Mitchell's mind lingered on the philosophy of what had happened to him. He'd been given an opportunity to become consumed by bitterness, to define himself as a victim who'd been wronged. Instead, he'd chosen transformation. The following morning, Mitchell visited the military detention facility where Santos was imprisoned. It was a decision he'd made without informing anyone else, a personal pilgrimage rather than an official visit. Santos didn't recognize Mitchell at first when he was brought to the visitation area. 3 years of prison life had aged him considerably. His hair had turned completely gray. His shoulders, once muscular from decades of hangar work, had diminished. He looked smaller, diminished by confinement. "Sir," Santos said uncertainly, then recognition bloomed in his expression. "Colonel, General Mitchell." "Hello, Derek," Mitchell said quietly. They sat separated by reinforced glass, speaking through phones. "I don't know why you're here," Santos said, his voice hoarse. "I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to see me suffer." "I'm not here because of you," Mitchell replied. "I'm here because I needed to understand something. I needed to know if the man I see in my memories, the colleague I once worked with, was real, or if I'd misunderstood you all along." Santos looked confused. "I tried to kill you." "Yes," Mitchell acknowledged. "But I think what you were really trying to do was kill the part of me that represented your failure. You couldn't kill me until you killed the idea that success was possible without the specific circumstances you believed you deserved." Mitchell paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm not here to forgive you, Derek. Forgiveness implies you've asked for it. You've been in prison for 3 years and haven't requested to speak with me once. I'm here to tell you that your crime has had an unexpected consequence. It's made me better. It's made our aviation community safer. It's made our institution stronger. You tried to destroy me, and instead, you created the catalyst for improvement that will help people for decades." Santos's face crumpled. Tears began running down his weathered cheeks. "I didn't want you dead. I just wanted you to fail. I wanted to matter more than you do." "I know," Mitchell said. "And that's the tragedy. You did matter. You had expertise, experience, knowledge, but you measured your worth by comparison to me, and when you came up short, you chose sabotage instead of acceptance. That choice cost you everything." Mitchell stood to leave. "I'm not coming back, Derek, but I wanted you to know that your attempt to destroy me has instead been transformed into something that helps others. That's justice greater than any punishment the courts could impose, knowing that your malice became the foundation for something good." Over the following years, Mitchell continued to build his legacy. He retired from active military service at the rank of Major General, having served 5 years as Commander of Army Aviation. His final act before retirement was to establish the Mitchell Aviation Safety Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing aviation safety, providing scholarships to young pilots, and creating educational programs based on the lessons he'd learned. On his final day of active duty, Mitchell stood before a formation of 500 pilots at Fort Rucker. He wore his dress uniform one last time, every medal and ribbon in place, his silver stars gleaming under the Alabama sun. "Throughout my career," he addressed the assembled pilots, "I've learned that success isn't measured by the obstacles you avoid. Success is measured by your response to obstacles you encounter. I was given a broken helicopter to fail my test. Instead, that broken helicopter became my teacher. It taught me about preparation, resilience, and the possibility of transformation." He paused, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "As you continue in aviation, you will face challenges. Some will be mechanical, some will be human, and some will be both. The question isn't whether you'll face adversity. The question is what you'll do with the adversity you face. Will you let it destroy you, or will you let it transform you? Will you become bitter, or will you become better?" The pilots applauded, but Mitchell continued. "The sabotage I experienced was designed to end my career. Instead, it redirected my career toward something meaningful, toward building safety systems that protect all of you. That's the power of transformation. That's the legacy I leave you." Mitchell's life had been forever altered by the moment he'd taken off in a deliberately compromised aircraft. That moment had been intended as a tragedy. Instead, through skill, character, and decades of determined effort, it had become an inspiration. The broken helicopter that Santos and Carver had sabotaged hadn't destroyed Mitchell. It had revealed who he truly was, a man capable of transformation, a leader capable of using personal trauma to build institutional change. The test he'd ultimately passed wasn't about flying an aircraft under ideal conditions. It was about maintaining integrity when betrayed, maintaining composure when facing death, and maintaining purpose when everything tried to destroy him. He'd been given a broken helicopter to fail his test. Instead, his emergency landing had become a triumph not just of survival, but of character, and that triumph continued to echo through the lives of everyone he'd influenced, inspiring safer skis for generations to come.